Hey guys, Loman02. It's been a while since I put a video up, but I kind of want to do another deck tech on a deck that's kind of been a crucible for me. And that is Grixis Aggro Control slash Grixis Midrange. So, the general concept behind this deck and the way it plays out, before I go down how I've kind of broken down some of these card piles, is, it's in a weird spot. Grixis is in a weird spot. So this is 100 card Singleton, and the biggest difficulty for Grixis is that it tends to use point or one for one exchange, and it tends to be in a bad spot in a meta with a lot of aggressive strategies. So what does the deck kind of pour against? It tends to be a little worse against rush style strategies like red deck wins. Generally, it has a very difficult time beating that. We'll kind of cover how we get after that in the board. And then just a smaller extent, White Weenie. It could eventually outlast White Weenie or White Aggro. But it has to get to about turn 4 or 5, and still be alive and have mana available to it to actually do that. So the way I've broken this pile set down is the first pile, 34, you see there, just is the mana base of this. It's not extremely interesting. We don't really have anything that cool in there. A couple of suboptimals like Crumbling Necropolis that could possibly get changed down. I'm not a huge fan of tapped lands. One thing of note in the actual mana base is we do have all the available scry lands. I think these are actually pretty good in this style of deck, because as you'll see eventually, we don't really have a lot of great card drawing. We have some of the best card drawing. We don't have a ton of it, so we do have a lot of filtering, and through cantrips. Our ability to just draw raw cards is generally going to be incremental unless you're looking at something like Ancestral Vision, Fact or Fiction, Dig Through Time, or Treasure Cruise. I say incremental, I mean like Snapcaster Mage is an automatic 2-for-1. So what you'll see is a lot of the cards we go through actually have 2-for-1 value, or we try to, as much as possible, get 2-for-1 value out of them, with a single card, because we don't have the best of card drawing in this. And the idea behind this deck is that, while it's going to struggle with the more aggressive strategies, what it's going to be generally good against is other mid-range decks, and against control decks that are trying to, just cast, bombastic spells like Elspeth, Sun's Champion, or Wormcoil Engines, you name it. But it'll tend to beat those because it can kind of chip away at their hand, it can chip away at their creatures, their mana base. The one cool thing, when you're looking at Grixis is that, you know, really the only thing that it doesn't have a good game against, depending on how you build it, is going to be enchantment-based decks. It's really the only permanent that it'll have difficulty dealing with. That and or just rapid flood of creature cards. You can use cards like Damnation or Toxic Deluge. Damnation, notably of which, is missing in this deck. Just wasn't a big fan of it. I found it was dead too often. Um, but generally speaking, we're going to one for one with cards like Lightning Bolt or Firebolt, or Burst Lightning. So that's the mana base. Going into this next pile of three, you have the 3 man lands. So this is a relatively creature-light deck. As you can tell from the statistics sitting at the top next to the title of the deck, we only have 12 creatures in the deck. Most of them tend to be extremely cheap. So this is the threat pile right here, this one that says 12. And generally speaking, I mean, like I say cheap, but we have Tombstalker, Tassiger, Gurmag Angler. Those are all relatively cheap cards because if you're playing this deck right and you're one for one exchanging with your opponent in the early to mid game, you're generally casting one of these cards for 1 to 2 mana and then leaving up counter magic, which allows you to essentially assume around turn 3 or 4 an aggro control role where you basically just protect your one threat and kill them in 3 to 4 turns. It's a little inefficient, but the deck is very decision intensive, and that's kind of what I think draws me to this style of deck. It doesn't really have a ton of like just windmill slam, I win the game right now. It just chips away incrementally and eventually just grinds your opponent out, which is kind of fun. And I was commenting with another player Sung, that in a lot of ways, to me, it feels like it plays out like a modern version of Jund, without like the so it plays out like Jund without the obvious card advantage, but it also plays with a higher degree of hidden information, which allows you to kind of, be a blue mage, if you will, and play head games with your opponent and force them to commit to lines that you want them to. Which is probably the biggest part of why I like the deck, because a lot of your information is veiled unless they get Gitaxian Probe off or Thoughtseize or Duress or something like that in the early game, and you're able to kind of direct the game in the direction you want to, so you can find your window for victory with the deck. Because, like I said, the games tend to be very tight with this deck because it's very threat light, and your decisions on how you get to that window in time where you can win can just be very fun. So we have the man lands because we are very threat light, and typically speaking, if we're playing against other control style decks, they'll have sweeper cards, and forcing them to have a one-for-one answer for these when they're generally going to be on card advantage cards like Wrath of God tend to be pretty good, and they can close out games. I mean, I've definitely killed with all four of these or all three of these cards right here, utilizing this deck. Not in recent history, but I have previously. Mystical Tutor is a card I'm trying on. I'm not really sure if it's right. So 90% of the time, well, correction. I, I've only had it in the deck for about 5 games, and so far what I've gotten was a Kolaghan's Command, because it was necessary for me to stay alive against specifically this card right here, Batterskull, and to get the last card of their hand. But typically, I think what I'm going to get with this deck is going to be Treasure Cruise and Dig Through Time, because this essentially allows me. It's kind of it seems a little cheesy, because you're essentially changing Mystical Tutor into Divination, if you will, a 2 mana Divination with Treasure Cruise in order to dig through time. But because we don't have an extremely large mana base, 37 lands, typically Treasure Cruise is going to be pretty good to, in the mid to late game, get you, 3 spells, 2 to 3 spells. And Dig Through Time, I think, punches up from the 2 cards you're getting. You're really staying at card parity when you Mystical Tutor for Dig Through Time, but you're not staying at card at parity in card quality. Card quantity, I would agree. Yes, it's a simple 0 for 0 exchange, but you're finding 2 cards that ideally either get you out of the situation you're in to find a place to win, or just to win the game. This X pile here, and these kind of just stand alone, are the cantrips. I think these are the most powerful ones for this deck. Of note, you'll see that Serum Visions is missing. I find with this deck that I tend to have my backup against the wall in the early to mid game. And I don't want a card that sets me up a turn later. I want a card that sets me up to either answer or win right now. So I think these tend to be more powerful. You'll note that Portent kind of, does not quite do what I was just saying. It's obviously a slow trip, but typically speaking, it allows me to set up permission, so I can draw into it on my opponent's upkeep, and then control their turn, so I can get the turn passed back to me, and ideally draw into a threat or more mana, or whatever the case may be. But it's kind of the most dubious of them. Preordain, pretty ubiquitous with most blue decks. It generally starts in almost every blue deck. Ponder, same thing. Opt, trying it out. I do like it better than Serum Visions because it allows me to get a draw immediately, or it allows me to get a draw that I have vetted immediately. Given I'm only seeing 1 card, if it's the right card, I can just draw into it. If it's not, I can definitely put it on the bottom. Also helps to make land drops. This is a control deck, a bit hard, although it's more, like I said, it's kind of somewhere between the sliding scale of aggro control and control. But there are times you're just playing pure control more often than not in the early to mid game, and you just need to make your land drops so you can cast your spells and stay alive. Brainstorm, quite a few fetch lands in the deck, quite a few shuffle effects, so I think Brainstorm is very strong. Again, I think it's generally ubiquitous with most blue decks. You tend to always see it. This next pile here is the removal, and actually Grim Lavamancer could probably go here. So let me cover the removal. So you have Fatal Push. At one point in time, I had Ghastly Demise in this deck. I ended up cutting that, and really because it just oftentimes wasn't getting it what I needed to get. And I wanted, more. I wanted actually more flexible cards. So I ended up actually, and it's cardinal sin, I know, going up on the curve and replacing it with Collective Brutality, because Collective Brutality can just do more. Yes, it can be card disadvantage. But against the aggro matchups, which is a matchup, as I said earlier, this deck has to be worried about. It can gain me crucial life. It can get rid of weenie creatures, and it can also fight against the control decks. So the card is overall more versatile, I think, than Ghastly Demise. And I ended up cutting that card because, well, it is cheaper. I just wasn't as impressed with it. And Collective Brutality has actually been great. Next up, you have Burst Lightning. Sorry for the textless cards, but it's a shock that has upside in the late game. Now, in the control matchup, so the reason I like these kind of cards is because in the control matchup, I can just dome an opponent for 4 and just win the game. That's oftentimes against control, you'll just be chipping away at them with stuff like Grim Lavamancer, maybe one hit off a Tombstalker, maybe a Snapcaster end step to flashback a Lightning Bolt or something like that. And you'll eventually just win that way because you'll be chipping at them with very efficient spells while they're casting 3 to 4 mana spells to try to counter it. You counter with a 2 to 3 mana spell, and you just eventually edge them out of the game. Burst Lightning is also just great because 2 damage in the early game, against an aggressive deck can kill a Thalia, can kill a Goblin Guide, kill many things, and just buy you time. Firebolt. I think this card's awesome. Now, it would obviously be better if it was an instant. This deck tends to like to play at instant speed, but having a sorcery that I can flashback, albeit for a large amount of mana, that can kill weenie creatures is extremely strong. It's essentially, and this could probably go in this pile too. This is the many or 2-for-1 removal pile. Um, it's generally a 2-for-1 over enough long enough time horizon. And I've been impressed with the card. Lightning Bolt, not much to be said. It is 1-for-1 card exchange, but it's 1 mana, 3 damage, very powerful card. Not much to be said about it. If you haven't played with it, give it a shot. It's been around forever, since the beginning of the game, and it's great. Is it Charm? Not a 2-for-1 card, but very flexible. So Is it Charm, can help in the control battle because it allows you to counter non-creature spells, which are generally tend to mean that you can. It helps you to win permission fights. 2 damage to target creature makes this card also a decent hitter in the aggressive matchups where your opponent's going to flood the board early. And rarely, but not never, or do I actually use the draw 2 and discard 2. That is card disadvantage. However, when you're looking at your best threats, being delve style threats, it tends to punch up. Because even though you're losing a card to do that, you're getting rid of some dead cards, and you're possibly making cards in your hand, to include Tombstalker, Tassiger, Gurmag Angler, or the Delve draw spells, Treasure Cruise and Dig Through Time, much more castable. Terminate, just a powerful card. It is 1-for-1 removal, but it answers anything, and anything without Hexproof or Shroud, and that's not bad. And then we have Diabolic Edict. This is a card that I am debating on cutting, but I tend to like it because, Thrun the Last Troll is a thing, True Name Nemesis is a thing, and this gives you outs to it in addition to the Liliana that we have over here in our Planeswalker pile. So I tend to like it, especially against like green style decks or decks that are going to play fewer threats, but more relevant threats. This card tends to be just fine, and the fact that it's instant speed is generally strong. Going to this next pile, you have our 2-for-1 removal and hand disruption pile. Forked Bolt, like I said, we already talked that one. It is a 2-for-1 over a long enough time horizon, and I tend to be happy with it. Grim Lavamancer. This card is an obvious 2-for-1, or has the capability to accrue you 2-for-1 value. It's a 1-mana card, and it can do 2 damage to anything if you spend a lot of cards. Like I said, we tend to spend a lot of cards in this deck that either cantrip or build incremental card advantage. So my graveyard tends to be of a decent size, and I like Grim Lavamancer for that reason, and it helps shore up the more aggressive matchups. And even against control, eventually it needs to be answered because it will kill the opponent. Next, you have Kolaghan's Command. Kolaghan's Command can kill Batterskull, can kill equipment, can get the last vital card out of their hand, can return, one of our few threats back to hand, and can randomly just do 2 damage and be decent in, the aggro matchups. So the card is flexible. That tends to be a trend in my style of decks. I generally enjoy flexible cards because they're more applicable in a large range of matches, but they're not bad in any given matchup. And I think that's important in 100 cards. So, I mean, as you start looking at like more 4-of constructed formats with smaller deck sizes, I think that may not be as true. Generally speaking, I think you want your deck to be very focused. And that can be true in like combo style 100 card decks. But given the inherent unpredictability or impredict of playing 100 cards over 60 and only one of each card means that in order to require redundancy, you need to generally cut out quite a bit of fat. And and also to be efficient, you need to have the flexible cards that allow you to do multiple things. So what is this deck trying to do? Like I said, it's trying to accrue incremental value, and it's trying to stay alive to get to the mid to late game where it can land 1 to 2 threats and just end the game with that threat after protecting it with its counter magic. So I guess kind of delving into that, if you will, and pun very much intended. What this card, and these style of cards allow you to do is essentially play more of each type of thing that your deck wants. So we want early interaction and removal. We want disruption. And cards like this just provide it. Well, I can't eschew, the need for powerful cards that do singular things like Lightning Bolt or, Thoughtseize. I can have cards that can have either effect, maybe to a smaller degree, but more flexible to situation. So Kolaghan's Command, I can't say enough good things about the card. In the 100 card format, I think Kolaghan's Command and or Dromoka's Command of that cycle are probably the 2 most powerful. And I don't even know which is better. Possibly Dromoka's Command is just cheaper. But they're both very powerful, and I've very much so enjoyed having both in the format. Toxic Deluge, just very efficient. The one thing I don't like about this card is that, generally when you want it, your back's already up against the wall. So there have been times I've had this card playing this specific deck and just not been able to cast it to kill what I needed to kill. But I was already pretty much losing at that point, anyways. And it's at that point, Damnation probably would have been better. But typically speaking, I don't want to kill my own threats, and sometimes my own threats are just gonna be tiny. They're gonna be like a Snapcaster Mage that I'll just ride to victory over a long enough time horizon, and it can be a very dead draw. Plus, I tend to think Toxic Deluge is a little better than Damnation in the control mirror, just due to the fact that it's cheaper and you can protect it, and it's also good against cards like Elsbeth Sun's Champion or like random tokens off of Lingering Souls. Because it's so much cheaper and like you don't have to spend a ton of life generally to get the advantage you need out of it. The next up is Hymn to Turek. Yeah, not much to be said about this card as well. Just singularly very powerful. It and Collective Brutality are the only two mana. Well, correction, I have one more 2 mana discard spell, but I think this one is on a much higher power level than Collective Brutality for what it does, if that makes sense, for what it specifically does. In the early game, this thing can just end games. Now, the one downside to playing cards like Hymn to Turek is that in the late game it can be extremely bad, especially if you're in a top deck war. But against control, it's still fine in the late game because generally their hand size is not going to go down to 0. And against the aggressive decks, unless you have it in your opener, your likelihood of drawing it after having the initial 7 is generally pretty low. So I think it's fine to have a card like this, even though it can go dead in the aggressive matchup. I just think its power is just so high and the upside of it's so high that it's worth having. So that if I draw it my first, 7 to 9 cards, I'm happy. If I draw it at 10 and beyond, I'm probably not as happy. But even at 10, it's still not bad. Even a card draw number 10 or card draw number 3 for 10 or 10 cards total, I'm still not extremely unhappy. It's probably when I started getting around like card number 12 to 13 that I would be unhappy drawing a Hymn to Turek, and the probability of it being drawn in that specific sequence is fairly low. Electrolyze, powerful 2-for-1 removal card, and it could just go to face. So, I mean, against control, you can just burn them on an end step, possibly flash it back with a Snapcaster, get some incremental damage in, and also just replace the card, which, is in my opinion, good enough. Arc Trail, this card is one of the very few like red 2-for-1s. One of the cards I've been thinking about the sideboard is I believe it's Forked Bolt, which I also think is a very powerful card for 1 mana. It has the possibility for obvious 2-for-1s, and so does this. And it definitely shores up the aggressive matchups. Against control, it's not horrendous. Oftentimes, I'll find against control, I'm just trying to use this to get incremental damage, and sometimes I'll do 1 damage to myself and 2 damage to my opponent, because I tend to find that with this deck, if I'm playing like blue-white control or like a loam control deck, I tend to be the beatdown. So me taking damage is not that relevant. I just want to either force them to make a mistake, i.e., countering an arc trail, or just take the damage and then through that incremental damage over time, end up winning the game. Dismember, just 1-for-1 removal, but very powerful, very efficient, very cheap, and I think good enough for the deck. And then Rise Fall. So Rise Fall is essentially our second copy of Hymn to Turek. However, it is a better draw in the late game, and you tend to want to use it more so in the mid to late game after the opponent has landed out and they've stopped playing lands. And even in the really late game, Rise is not terrible. Now, I've yet to use, I think I've used Rise maybe 1 out of like 10 times with this card. I tend to use Fall to get the last 2 cards out of my opponent's hand, or the last, 3, maybe 2 of 3 cards out of their hand. And I think having a secondary Hymn to Turek is extremely powerful. Being able to interact on that level and just get, a 2 mana 2-for-1 is very good. Obviously, Fall, if you've never seen this card, if it hits lands, it does nothing. So you don't want to just pop it off, like you would a Hymn to Turek. I mean, Hymn to Turek can obviously hit lands. This card cannot. So you need to be careful in how you sequence it. But still very powerful, and I tend to find that if I set it up right, I generally get 2 cards out of my opponent's hand. This next pile is just discard. Collective Brutality, already talked about it. I love it because it's very flexible and it's pretty good in every matchup that you may have. Thoughtseize, just a powerful discard effect. Yep, 2 damage, but very powerful. I still even like this against burn decks because generally speaking, it's going to save you damage in the long run. Duress, I think this card's great. Folks are not playing, all creatures, generally speaking. Even against White Weenie, I still like Duress because you can get their Anthem effect. You can get their 1 4-mana Planeswalker that they're eventually going to curve into. You can get an O-Ring, a Council's Judgment, Armageddon, Ravages of War. There's a lot of things that those style of decks play. Equipment that this card can get. Even if they play a Stoneforge and like get their Batter Skull, you can just get it out of their hand, and that's it's good to go. And they have a 1/2 for 2 mana. Inquisition of Kozilek, same thing. I think if I were to cut a discard spell, it would be Inquisition. But because our meta is fairly aggressive, I tend to like this card because it helps you bridge into the mid game and stay alive. The next pile here is our creature pile, and a lot of these cards could go into like the 2-for-1 pile as well. Like Snapcaster Mage is really a 2-for-1, and it could be a 2-for-1 for anything. I mean, it can be counter magic in this big 20 card pile right here. It could be discard, it could be removal, you name it, or it could just be chip damage off of like a burst lightning or a lightning bolt back to the opponent's face. Many things. Thing in the Ice, not a 2-for-1, but a card that often kind of punches up for me. I like it in the meta that I'm currently in because in a lot of ways it acts as like a wall of omens or a spell skite, and it can block extremely well, generally accruing 2-for-1 value. And then just over a long enough time horizon, once it flips, it's a very fast clock, and it buys you a ton of time because if they've been playing creatures into it, which they generally have to attack around it. Um, you just flip them all back to hand, and they're sitting there trying to cast 3 to 4 cards in a turn, while you're hitting them with a 7 power attacker, which is a pretty tough order. It's a pretty tall order. All right, so Dark Confidant, one of the very few card engines in the deck. Basically, Dark Confidant and Jace the Mind Sculptor are the only 2 card engines in the deck. Everything else is very incremental and just 2-for-1 kind of advantage, but he is a 2-for-1 if he gets to live for 1 turn. If he doesn't, well, then he's not. He just sucked up removal. Young Pyromancer, also really a 2-for-1. That's why I'm kind of putting him over here now. Young Pyromancer, if he lives or if you cast a spell on the same turn he's cast, you've already acquired some value off him or you accrued some value off of him. And is a 1-1 really worth a card? Maybe not, but like 2 to 3 1-1s certainly is worth a card. And that's kind of what he does. Just over time, he builds his own extra cards. It's really virtual card advantage, but he isn't a card engine. Baleful Strix, also a 2-for-1 advantage card. This thing's great in the Green X mirror or the Green X matchups because you play it out, it redraws another card, and it blocks anything without trample very successfully, and tends to get rid of like their best threat. I very much so love the card, and I think it's done a lot of good work for this style of deck. So not the first like really non 2-for-1 threat. I guess you could have considered Thing in the Ice not really a 2-for-1, but I tend to see the time it gains you as being 2-for-1. Um, True Name Nemesis. Not much to be said about this card. Like in some ways, it's 2-for-1 advantage because it blanks so many cards that opponents template in their decks to remove creatures. Um, but at the end of the day, really all it is just a very resilient beater that allows you to slowly grind out the game, and or just buy time against the aggressive decks because it can just sit there and block and kill things all day long. Vidillion Click, again, just really a beater at the end of the day, but it's very disruptive as well. Obviously, it does not acquire advantage because you're not discarding the card out of the opponent's hand, but you're getting to get the most relevant one or the one that's most relevant given your game plan. Plus, I don't think it's valid to also discount the hidden information that you get by casting cards like Vendilion Click. Even when you cast an Inquisition and Whiff, like it's still value added to your game plan because you know better how to play the game. Um, and Vendilion Click's also just a 3/1 flyer for 3, which is still just a great rate. Um, Batterskull. So this is a card that I kind of had to concede to putting in the deck. I don't really like 5-mana threats in this style of deck. So Batterskull and Torrential Gearhulk are probably the closest to the chopping block. Although I had to concede that like Batterskull is kind of a necessary evil for this deck because when you're playing against very aggressive decks, once you stabilize, you need a way to either win rapidly or assure that their capability to win is negated while you're winning. So Batterskull is not a fast win con; it's actually extremely slow. But it is a card advantage card, so it can go over here because if someone removes it, you just pop it back to hand, and recast it. If someone casts an artifact removal spell on it, you have 3 mana up. You're just acquiring, generally speaking, advantage off of the card. But also, against like White Weenie, it's tough to block, and once you've swept their board with Toxic Deluge or used point removal to kill their stuff, their most relevant stuff, it becomes very difficult to race it. And for red deck wins, if you get to hit with this thing and gain life, generally speaking, they lose the game. If they're able to Skullcrack for a turn and or burn off one of their own blockers, if you will, in response to what would be the life gain. Well, I guess it would be in response. That's old school stack damage. But if you would gain life off it, they kill the creature before damage step in combat. Then they can probably still win. But if you ever attack a red deck wins with this and gain the life, the game's over. You're probably going to win. Gritbag Angler, just a threat. It's a 5/5 for 1 black mana in this deck. That's how I see the card, and 5/5 for 1 is fine with me. Another card we consider is Death Shadow is just it's just a pure threat. It'd be kind of a nombo with the Batterskull, but this deck tends to end games at relatively low life totals, so that could be correct. Another thing that I've considered, before I start describing how great Tasker is actually taking out the Gurmag Angler and possibly like the Tombstalker, because I do have a very high number of Delve cards, and sometimes there are awkward situations where I'm not capable of actually delving. Generally speaking, I'm able to get rid of it with like a Timely Brainstorm or Jace the Mind Sculptor or something like that. But there are times when I don't want as many delve cards as I have in the deck, or I don't want to draw, more than two. I think over a total game, I'm pretty happy if I draw three. Now, that's obviously conditional. If I'm drawing cards like Treasure Cruise and Dig Through Time that kind of fuel or like a self-licking ice cream cone to generate more delve, um, then I tend to be okay doing like 4 to 5. But three is typically the number of delve spells you want to draw. So my consideration has been actually like cutting one of these two cards and either 1 to 2 maybe, and trying out one of two cards. One would be Delver of Secrets as just a very early threat that you can back up with counter magic, and the second one would be Bone Picker, which is really a turn 2 play that would be predicated upon using removal on an opposing weenie creature and then casting it for 1 black mana. If you're not familiar with Bone Picker, it's a 4 mana, three colorless, 1 black, 3/2 Death Touch Flyer, I believe creature type Vulture, and it can be cast for 3 less if a creature died on the turn that you cast it. Since this deck's very good at killing creatures and it's effective at that. I think Bone Picker would actually be a decent threat for the deck, and it also actually blocks decently well too because of the Death Touch clause. But it's also a 3/2 flyer, which would be the more relevant part is that you just kind of like use it to accrue incremental damage. So Tombstalker and Gurmag are in here for now. Like I said, considerations to removing one or both to try out Bone Picker and Delver. The only issue that I have with removing both is that both those cards, the cards I'm mentioning, Delver and Bone Picker, both die to stuff like Lightning Bolt or Burst Lightning or whatever. And these cards don't, and they're a little beefier. Uh, Tasker, I don't know how much I need to talk about him before I go into Torrential Gearhulk. Tasker is just a card engine, so I mean he can go over into the 2-for-1 pile, and he's also a 1 to 2 mana, 4/5, essentially mono black or black Goyf, which is great. You can't really complain about the card. If the game ever goes long against control, you can just start drawing cards, which is pretty solid against in the control mirror. And then we have Torrential Gearhulk, which is really a 2-for-1 creature as well, but also just a big body. This card has saved me a lot of times, but there are also times when I just don't want to draw this thing. Like, you don't want to draw this thing early, and if you do, you want to have a relatively landed hand that has good bridging cards to continue to build up your mana base. When you do cast this thing, it feels like the best thing you can do, because typically speaking, it either gets back another 2-for-1 card, like Cryptic Command or like Kolaghan's Command, kills something, blocks something, destroys an equipment, gets rid of their hand, counters their best spell, taps their team, whatever. I mean, it can do a lot of things as well as Snapcaster in the deck, and it's just a big body and can end the game fast. So I don't think I'm going to remove this card. I think, I've been very happy with it is being the sole, like, quote unquote 6-drop in the deck. Yes, I have cards that cost more than 6, but this one right here is the only true 6-drop in the deck. The next pile you have here are the Planeswalkers, and really they can go into card advantage as well. Liliana, not a lot of folks think of her as card advantage. She very much so is. She's just invested card advantage. Is how you have to look at her, because even though you're going to stay at card parity when you're discarding with your opponent, utilizing the Liliana, if you ever use the -2, you're going up a card, and if you ever get to 6, like, you're just acquiring, basically it's a 2-for-1 at the end of it. So you've discarded X cards, they've discarded X cards, but they lose, half of whatever their board is by the time you max her out. So against control, it tends to be a sub game for who can get rid of the Liliana first if you ever land this thing. And against aggro, it just tends to buy you some incremental advantage in time and maybe like 1 to 2 cards. Even getting the opponent, like on a red deck wins, to attack this thing and kill it after you force them to sacrifice a creature is not a bad use of it, because you're essentially 2-for-1ing them, because doing damage to your face is card advantage to red deck wins, is how you need to look at it, I think. If we go into this next pile here, this is just the true drawing pile. So you have Dig Through Time. That is it's obviously a 2-for-1, but I look at it as just vast card draw. Treasure Cruise, 3 for 1. Just very strong, solid card. Ancestral Vision rather. Also 3 for 1 advantage, and then Factor Fiction, either 2 for 1 or 3 for 1 advantage here. Plus, it fuels Delve. So the card is actually like its secondary ability of it not going to the bottom of the graveyard or the bottom of the library, but into the graveyard is actually relevant in this deck. And we also have cards like Kolaghan's Command that can actually recurse things from the graveyard as well, so that we can get back a creature threat if we happen to discard one, etc. The last pile of 20 here is our counter magic package. So starting it off, we have Spell Pierce. Just I think an all-around good card, just because like I said, I think Thoughtseize is good, or Spell Pierce is good for the same reason I think Thoughtseize is. I like this still in the aggressive matchups because it can get Armageddons, it can get Fire Blast, it can get just random. It can get Sulfuric Vortex, Shrine of Burning Rage. There's a lot of things that Spell Pierce can get that are actually relevant, and we want to have ways to deal, very efficiently with those kind of cards. Spell Snare, a lot of great 2-drops out there. Being able to spend 1 mana and a card to get rid of, a great 2-drop like Thalia, like Handwar Militia, like the aforementioned Shrine of Burning Rage. It's just very strong. Force Spike, I just think this is a great card to have on the draw and or play. When you're able to Force Spike their turn 2 play or their turn 1 elves or something like that, it's just tends to be very good. And it's just very efficient. Mana Leak, just very powerful for the mana requirements. Counterspell, and I think deserves a just nod from most blue decks if you're playing any permission. Memory Lapse, tend to be very happy with this, especially in the mid to late game when the opponent plays a card that may not be that relevant. But it's not really relevant, but you want them to draw it again, so you get a second turn of them essentially not drawing a good card. Being able to put a card on top, some folks would look at, I think, is being a disadvantage, but it tends to mean that you can't get beaten by variance. So I tend to very much so like having a card like Memory Lapse. At the mana cost of 2 mana, it's just extremely undercosted, and it's a powerful effect. Miscalculation, a little worse than Mana Leak, but the capability to cycle this card is oftentimes very relevant. It does help also fuel Delve, which is not an irrelevant thing when you're playing this deck. Negate, I think, there's a lot of very powerful non-creature spells that you want to be able to counter, and a 2-mana rate is just highly relevant, and it will tend to allow you to play your 1 to 2 mana threats and also just leave up counter magic on the turn you do it. Remand, again, 2 mana, but you're drawing a card off of it and essentially buying yourself a turn of your opponent untapping their mana. So your opponent really, like, if you're playing Remand right, your opponent gets half of a turn. It's like half of a time walk because they get to draw a card and they don't get to untap their mana, is essentially what it says. Counterspell, just been great since the beginning of time. Very singularly good at what it does. Kind of like how I assessed Lightning Bolt, I assessed Counterspell as well. Mana Drain, has all the obvious perks of Counterspell, but at the same time also can build mana. It's not always that pertinent in this deck. I think the most broken things I've been able to do is cast an earlier Delve spell based on my graveyard size. And I think once I was able to cast a True Name Nemesis and also leave up counter magic after doing so. So it's not at its best in this deck, but having an additional, and as you see so far, like my counter magic, I want to be as efficient as possible or do something special. And all of this counter magic is extremely cheap. It's 2 mana or less, with the exception of a few that we'll get to. Counter Squall, another negate for the deck, but also accrues incremental damage with this deck, which this deck is all about. Like just getting 2 extra damage in there. May not seem that big, but over enough time and you're chipping away at them, it can definitely win games. Complicate, 3 mana, but when you're able to use this for its cycling cost and counter a spell, it is a pure 2 for 1. I mean, it can go realistically in this pile right here because that's what it does. I mean, it acquires you advantage. Disallow, I do tend to like this card a little more than Forbid, because like I said, this deck does not have it doesn't have a bunch of vast drawing engines. Disallow can have more relevant effects. For instance, like it can kill a planeswalker in response to an ultimate, essentially blanking an ultimate. It can blank a manland for a turn. It does so much. And if you don't need that, it's also just a counterspell, which is just fine. Dissolve, another 3 mana card here. That's just a 1 for 1. the scry effect is very relevant. Like I said, I play the scry lands, and having the ability to scry tends to be extremely good. I mean, I think like if you start looking at it like over time, like two scries may actually be worth a card, realistically, because those are two cards that you don't need that maybe you put at the bottom, or maybe you do need and you get to draw into on the following turn. So I think scrying over enough time could be looked at as advantage. Undermine, incremental damage again, and it's 3 mana, so you sometimes this is probably one of the worst ones, but 3 damage is still 3 damage, and it's kind of nice to tack it on to just a card that does what Counterspell does. Cryptic Command, 2 for 1 again. We could probably move it over here. Um, you tend to kill one of their spells and also draw a card, but it can do a lot of interesting things. And honestly, in this deck, I think tends to maximize its range of abilities. It's not uncommon that I actually do tap their creatures down or bounce things just to buy a turn, a window to kill them with like one of my delve threats that would have otherwise been blocked. So the card's very powerful, as I'm sure you probably know. Dismiss could also go in the 2 for 1 pile because Dismiss is just basically a worse version of Cryptic Command. It's easier to cast. Counterspell, draw card. So it basically says you discard a card for the turn, you don't get to use your mana, and I draw an additional card. So you're going up a card and you're essentially buying a whole turn. So in a lot of ways, it's like it's trying to emulate in a lot of ways, or Remand is trying to emulate what Dismiss does for less mana, but it actually kills their draw for a turn and leaves their mana tapped if you're using it to the most efficient way, or the most efficient way possible. Force of Will, at the end of the day, like this is just a great card against combo, and and when in a pinch, when you need it, it can definitely save your life if you have to 2 for 1 yourself. It's obviously a 2 for 1, but I think this deck kind of wants this because there are times when like you tap out for a planeswalker, and if you don't have a card like this, you can just get run over by a bomb off the top of the opponent's deck, or they could just be sandbagging one until you tap out. Mystic Confluence, another 2 for 1 or 3 for 1 possibly card in the deck. This could go under drawing as well, but typically speaking, you're going to use some combination of bounce, draw, and or counter. Typically, all three. I wouldn't say there is a specific mode. I have cast it before just to use it as Jace's Ingenuity to draw 3 cards in instant speed, but typically speaking, I'll use some combination of them. It's not uncommon to do 1/1/1 where you bounce one creature, maybe even your own, because we do have cards like Torrential Gearhulk, like Snapcaster Mage, that are actually sometimes better in your hand because of what you have in your graveyard than they're on the board. But oftentimes you'll bounce, like one of your opponent's threats, force them to recast it, counter their spell, and then draw a single card. Which is still just great advantage. And then Logic Knot's the last card. It's 2 mana counterspell, one of the weaker counterspells, but it is 2 mana at the end of the day because realistically you're using your graveyard to cast it. So that's the baseline deck. It tends to be very good against green X decks. It tends to be good against control decks. Where it tends to languish is against aggressive decks. So as we go into the board, I'll kind of show you how I've decided to build the board. I've decided very much so to hate out white aggressive decks and red aggressive decks. You see Chill in the sideboard, which is an interesting choice because we are actually a red deck as well. However, I think, typically speaking, red deck wins is going to tend to be more efficient than our red cards are. And we tend to be more mana intensive than the red deck, so we'll generally tend to draw more. And I think Chill is very so strong in that matchup that it's worth having in the board, even of a deck that casts red spells. Flashfire, pretty ubiquitous with the breaking the red matchup. It's also just very good against green decks as well, so I tend to like it. It's just flexible. Hydroblast, Flash Flood, and Blue Elemental Blast I think are generally in almost every blue sideboard. Flash Flood being the worst of them, just because blue tends to struggle against red decks at the end of the day. Also, if it's like a more like a goblin or permanent based red deck, you could put in Pyroclasm and Whip Flare. But I tend to have these reserved for the white weenie matchup, but they're not, per se, exclusively for that matchup. Sun Droplet, it could be a Dragon's Claw as well, but I think Sun Droplet is going to tend to buy more incremental advantage over time. That could be right or wrong. I'm not sure. Spellskite also comes in. It's just a great blocker, and it can blank a lot of good burn spells against red deck wins. We have Dark Blast as well. Dark Blast is great against White Weenie. It's actually good against Green X as well, which makes the card pretty flexible. And because it has Dredge, it actually also fuels Delve very well for this deck. So it could even go main, possibly, but I just haven't found the space for it yet. Dread of Night is pretty specific to the white matchup. It's a pretty insular card. Massacre is generally just it's 4 white. It's 4 white weenie, but you could bring it in against a lot like Maverick decks or like a Selesnya deck as well, and it may not be horrendous. Virtue's Ruin, just straight up to hose white. Perish green. So against the green X matchups, what I tend to want to bring in are Perish, Dark Blast, possibly the Clasms if they run a lot of mana elves, and the Flash Freeze. So there's a lighter sideboarding plan against that because I don't tend to fear that style of deck. The only card that I have singularly that is really against control is Search for Iskanta, mostly because I want to try the card out. I don't know if it's quite good enough in the main because we tend to eat our graveyard so much, but it also fuels the graveyard as well. So, the card has some merits to it. I just tend to think it's a little too invested. And as you'll know, like we don't have like cards like Impulse in this deck. We don't have cards like Tainted Pact in this deck, and if we were to, we'd probably want to cut our 4 islands down to two standard islands and 2 snow-covered islands. Um, because typically speaking, like this deck doesn't have any like windmill slam, answers. It just has incremental answers, and a lot of the cards are fairly replaceable amongst each other because of the flexibility we've built into the deck. And we'd rather spend our money or our cards rather, you can call it money, I suppose, impacting what it is we want to impact as opposed to finding a card to impact that. So one of the things you gain when you run cards like Collective Brutality or Kolaghan's Command that can serve multiple functions is you tend to be able to reduce your dead card count. By having those flexible cards, because at the end of the day, like Impulse is kind of a dead card count because it's taking up mana to do essentially to find you what you already need. But if you already drew what you needed, why would you need Impulse? Is kind of the debate. And that's why I think in this deck you're going to tend to have your back against the wall. And if you're casting cards like Impulse or Tainted Pact, you're going to find what you need, but you're going down on a card and time advantage to actually find it, which is not great when you tend to assume that you're going to be getting beat down because you need to answer the board as fast as you can. So the general concept that I've kind of gone in, the approach I've gone in with building this deck is that I don't want cards like that. I just want cards that do what I need them to do to beat the decks I need them to beat. So that's the deck. I hope you guys enjoyed this deck tech on what I call Grixis Beauty. I think this is probably one of my favorite decks to play, although I do not think it is the best. I think it's actually probably one of the worst color pies in 100 card because it just tends to die to the most common aggressive strategies because it doesn't have a lot of life gain, and its advantage is very incremental and not sweeping. So you can't end the game fast. You don't have like a Time Vault combo in here, like a Blightsteel Tinker combo. You just have a 5/5 beater and counter magic and removal and hand disruption. And at the end of the day, why I find that fun is because it's very decision intensive. Because you always know, like you can never expect that your top deck is going to serve you the answer you need. So every resource is crucial and needs to be used exactingly if you want to stay alive to eventually win the game. And for me, that's fun because I think it's a challenge. I think it's a lot harder to play than like a deck like 4-Color Blood or White Weenie because sometimes those decks just play themselves. Like in 4-Color Blood, like your biggest decisions tend to be like what mana do I fetch with this fetch land, based on my possible top decks. You'll always top deck well in that deck, generally speaking, unless you like hit like 7 lands in a row. But if you draw a card, like you're going to top deck well in that deck. If you're drawing a card in this deck, you can top deck poorly because sometimes you just draw like a lightning bolt and like they're at 20 life and they have like 5 attackers coming at you or something, and you're just going to bolt one and be like, okay, well I'm dead now. So every decision tends to be very important. One of the struggles you have with this style of deck, though, because of that problem set, is that if you have to mulligan aggressively, like it tends to be much more difficult to win games. That all said, and although it is bad against the most common aggressive strategies, I think the deck is pretty strong against green X decks. And I also think it's actually pretty good against like the blue white or Esper style combo control or control decks. Because it's so much more efficient than they are. So at the end of the day, like I said, it's kind of somewhere between an aggro control and a true control deck. I would say in the format on a sliding scale, like Jeskai Tempo is probably like the best or the archetypical aggro control deck. Blue white or Esper combo control is probably the archetypical control deck, and this is somewhere in between the two. And I think the deck is exceedingly fun to play because it does have a lot of play to it. There's a lot of decisions in what role you need to assume based on the situation and what you know of the game. And the other cool part is the deck deals in a lot of hidden information because it only utilizes 12 creatures and has a maximized spell count. You tend to have a lot more instant sorceries that your opponent, that are going to give you incremental one-time effects that your opponent doesn't know about. So you tend to be able to, if you will, pump fake your opponent into making decisions that could be direly wrong based upon the information that they don't know. So this is Grixis Beauty. I hope you guys enjoyed this 100-card Singleton deck tech. And if you haven't joined the format before, please join us on Saturday. We play this format at 1600 Eastern Standard Time. And I hope you guys enjoyed the deck tech, and I'll see you around. Take care now.